about you, but there's a lot of information that was just shared, and actually Denise and I and Healthcare with Harm were sort of like, how are we going to sort of engage in the Q&A, because we do cover so many different things. So I think that the first thing that, I think the first thing is, how does this, let's take a couple questions. How does this relate to what you're doing, and so we can sort of hear about who you are, and then the questions that have come up, because we've started with distribution and health and financing, and again, I'm going to try and bring the microphone, so maybe Lucia, you can also do that, bring it down for some inquiries. So one of the things that I think, an example for our anchor institutions that we haven't targeted, but it got us curious about this, which was Kaiser purchases pre-made food, I think from California, but it goes to Ohio or Idaho? Iowa. It's called Mom's Meal. Mom's Meal. So here we are. We produce the food here. We send it to Idaho, it gets produced here, and it comes back to California. And so these are like sort of these just real clear examples of opportunities that we can sort of think about, given we now understand that Healthcare with Harm is doing this kind of work, that Democracy Collaborative is doing this kind of work. And I'm just curious from the folks in here, I know that a lot of people locally are having conversations about procurement with the K-12 systems, with community colleges, with direct to your city or your county. And so, what are some of the opportunities that have shown up, and what are some of the challenges that have shown up locally for you, and so see how it fits into this larger picture. You're welcome to get tea to wake up.
I would just make a comment that sometimes it's hard in a system to see the other parts of the system. So one comment would be just, I think it's important to focus on where you are and where you sit. So we're a bunch of people who are buying things, organizations buying things. And I think your presentation was really helpful to be able to say, as people who buy a lot of stuff, what can we do to articulate that we want sustainable food, we want it ideally locally sourced, and set some goals around it. And then we're willing to look at how to make the trade-offs, or kind of have the flexibility to figure out how to get this done. Because if we could buy it right now, we would, and it's not here. So one thing is, I think, thinking about what's in your own control, and how do you really use that. The second thing is, I think it's really hard for suppliers, particularly if you're a local business, to know, okay, well, that Mom's example, how would I ever know that we're sending meals to Idaho to then come back here? And so one thought might be, just an idea to percolate on, is creating a kind of, it's almost like a marketplace, where the institutional buyers could come and say, hey, we've identified some opportunities where we're going externally and we could be doing it locally. Here's what we're looking for. Are any of you now able to do that? Would you be able to do that in the next 1, 3, 5 years? And what would you need to do it? Because I think that way then we could start to really align this kind of big amorphous, not necessarily around demand, with more local opportunities that exist now, vendors and businesses, as well as longer term.
Who's raising? Oh, good.
Okay. So my question relates to this first one that's already written down here, but I've been doing work around potential food policy strategies at UC Berkeley with this new Berkeley Global Campus that they're planning to build in Richmond. And I've kind of been stuck because it's hard to incentivize huge institutions to procure in such a way, or do work in such a way that not only benefits the institution but also the surrounding community. And I think that's the link that is oftentimes missing. Like with the work at Kaiser, it's great that you guys are working on creating, better procurement strategies and policies. But then what's the kind of preventative aspect that you're doing by working within the community itself to actually get healthy food options available and accessible to people living in places like Richmond and Oakland, where there's not always fresh produce available or even like prepared food available to people here. So I'm just curious about what are the opportunities where institutional providers like Kaiser and UC Berkeley, I mean, we're both in the Bay Area, and there's both of them have this, great public mission to serve the community, but what happens in the food system where they can come together to actually do that, not just within the institution, but also beyond it?
It's a good question. I don't know, obviously, I can't turn to Jane Kaiser and say, do you have the answer? Because we're actually
I think that's what we're doing here.
Figuring it out.
Can I respond? Because I actually think Kaiser's a really good example of this. So I think these institutions can not only do that work internally, but I think they can be externally facing. For example, Kaiser was an investor in the fund that financed a lot of those deals. They actually provided, in their case, grant capital to help prop up this fund that now is able to provide capital to all these transactions that are supporting all these businesses throughout the state, outside of their own campuses. So I think these institutions have the ability not only to be, to create the demand for this kind of product, but also to invest in the businesses, to invest their own capital in the businesses that are going to create the supply for them.
Can I just ask one follow-up to that? Is there a chance, I mean, this is a lofty goal, but is there a way that places like Kaiser and UC Berkeley could come together to finance and fund an aggregator locally based, so that not just UC Berkeley and Kaiser can source from them, but also, corner stores can, and people could use it for their local businesses and restaurants?
It's called Anchors for Resource. That's what we're hoping for. No, but really, we really know that these are the issues, like having these built key bridge places, and that's one of the planning processes, to sort of identify that and where those locales could be, where is the infrastructure, so that the investment becomes more focused and really clear in terms of what our intent is, because we're collectively on the same page.
So let me make a couple of comments. So I think one thing that's important to understand is there's a lot of unwinding going on. So if we were in the 1950s and you're looking at Kaiser Permanente's procurement, or UC Berkeley's for that matter, or any institution, about 90% of it would have been local purchasing, and not because of local purchasing policies, right? That was just the way business was done back then. And what happened, and this was talked about in Hu's presentation, but you saw that group purchasing organization, that supply chain, and it's kind of, you can think of this on a consumer level as, how did Walmart become as large as it is today, what have you. So that you had this group purchasing, and at least initially it was cheaper, right? And it saved money for the institutions. And then, of course, they lost market knowledge in the process, and when you lose market knowledge, that allows the group purchasing organization to raise the price, right? And that's the Walmart model too, right? It's everyday low prices until there's no alternative. And so I think there's some real good faith efforts being made, sort of recognition that this has actually become destructive to communities and sustainability and whatnot. But there is this whole unwinding process that is happening slowly, and I can give additional best practice examples, and I think there's good efforts being made. We saw some here, but that's part of what we're looking at. It took, unfortunately, a few decades to get to the system we have today, so it's not something that's going to happen immediately. That said, I mean, I think you heard a couple areas where there's potential, such as at least with Kaiser, you heard about catering, you heard about food processing, and those are certainly areas that we hope to explore in our work.
Hi everyone, I'm Diana. I'm with the Community Alliance of Family Farmers, and we've been working on institutional procurement for the last decade, fiscal food focus and healthcare without harm. And I just have so many different thoughts swirling in my head, because I feel like I'm really excited that this group is taking this on, and just kind of want to put out there that there have been these efforts that we've tried aggregation hubs, we ran an aggregation hub that ultimately failed. from 2004 to 2009. And there are other efforts that are happening. I'm really excited about AgLink and the demand that they felt. I think they're going about it in a different way. But it's a long-term process. There's a need to work within this large global food system that has developed over the last several decades, and trying to shift and get them to kind of move back in the direction that we want in localizing more food systems, while also building up capacity for local entrepreneurs and businesses to be able to take back some ownership. So I think it's a both and both are really, really long-term ventures that are going to require a lot of thought around that. There's also, I'm not sure if there's anyone here from the Hope Collaborative in the room. I don't see Sabrina, but you know that they also did a feasibility study that we were involved in Oakland that looked at aggregation points and how can we support more institutions and more local procurement. And I know there are a few efforts to go down with Veritable Vegetable and another entrepreneur, I believe it was at Code Soy, to see if we could use some existing infrastructure to support more institutional procurement and looking at starting small and different ways that we can work with small businesses and then work our way up to larger institutions. So I just encourage folks to look back at some of that research that's already been started and then some of the efforts that have happened in the East Bay. And then that leads me to my actual question, which is about, I think it's a good point to focus on Richmond and Oakland in terms of the community health impacts. And then I wanted to know if we're looking at the larger food system, which is much more regional in scale to be able to meet those needs of the communities, statewide and even national and international, to really be able to support the needs of low-income communities in these two cities. So I'm just kind of curious to hear more about the scope of the food system that we're talking about.
Well, I think what we're actually looking at is looking at procurement because we want to look at the demand side and where there's points of entry. And what's good is we have these organizations that actually look at this more regional, national space with us so that it informs that question, in terms of who might actually come in and align with the needs locally. But our planning process is fairly clear in terms of looking at opportunity to make entry to leverage procurement space so that we can actually target economic development. But that's my impression, for the 6 months we've been going. So for those who might want to
If you had some ideas about that.
Well, when I walked in, I'm sorry I missed the first part of it. We tended to look at California statewide when we're looking at food systems and trying to localize back into local food systems or regional food systems, because we can't support the Bay Area community from even a 250-mile radius. We're looking at California statewide as one way to get closer even. But when I walked in, we were talking about climate change, and then that threw me out too, because we're seeing our farmers are moving away from California as we're going through climate change and through the drought. So no, I don't have solutions right now, but I mean, we have talked about tier 1, tier 2 sourcing from as close as possible to statewide, but in the face of the changing climate, there's a lot more to that discussion.
We've just been running into this question of scale around access to more sustainable meat. Right? So 80% of all the antibiotics are used in meat production as opposed to human medicine. That's contributing to antibiotic resistance. So at one level, wouldn't it be great to get California grown meat that's sustainable, so that you're not tracking across lots of time zones to serve that. And so we want to do that. And at the same time, you want to change the whole system because you want Purdue and Tyson's and all these other guys to stop, raising animals on concentration camps and feeding them hormones and all this other stuff. So we need to do, I think we need to do both and depending on, we just need to do both and across the whole sector. So that's our little microcosm of that, as one example.
I think one of the things we've been talking about too is how can a combination of procurement and investment sort of look at interventions along the whole food system spectrum. So really great projects that are going on in Oakland and Richmond that are addressing acute food insecurity needs in those neighborhoods. We don't want those need to stay and be bigger and supported, so maybe that's an investment strategy to keep those going. It's not about institutions coming in and buying the food that would go to Oakland or Richmond residents, but it's sort of like, how can we keep that acute food insecurity intervention going in some of these communities and also do some of these other interventions along the way? Because the truth of the matter is, we need land, air, and water to produce food for Oakland, for Richmond, for all of the communities in the Bay Area. So I think it's looking at it from a food systems approach and what are all those different interventions we can participate in.
And one of the things I do love about what's happening on a local level and local farms is, people are looking at different meats. And I know Hank's looking, it's like not just beef, it's, how do we look at goats and rabbits and food that was a part of our chain for a very long time until everything came about the hamburger. And those can take a lot less land. So that's
water.
And water, so and produce a lot like methane. So I mean, these are important things that we have to add to the mix that aren't even being brought into the conversation. Certainly at a local level, but not within this regional system.
So I have a question, and it's a question to all of you here, if anyone knows the answer. So we have a list of sort of food innovations and enterprises here in the region. The question is, part of the strategy is just to grow what already exists and to increase, through aggregation opportunities for them to hire and to become larger. What's promising on this? I've not even looked at it. Where are the anchors for something that could be quite substantial if we get anchor institutions invested in local regional food systems?
I looked at the list. There are right now 19 organizations listed. Of those 19 organizations, only 7 do actual food production. And if you throw in New Hope Farms, that makes 8 out of 20. We probably, in the aggregate, farm on less than 30 acres of land.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Hank Pereira. I own, as a worker owner, New Hope Farms. I do other food justice work. Our farm is actually surrounded by rangeland where there are hundreds of heads of cattle that are grazed by a grass-fed operation called 5 Dot Ranch. They have cattle all over Northern California, from what I understand. And I'm puzzled by the need to procure beef, not to challenge your figures about Kaiser procuring beef, but 6,000 meals a day multiplied out by days per year, multiplied out by how many cattle would be required to provide each patient a third of a pound of meat for each of those 3 meals, which may or may not fit your nutritional guidelines, but is probably more than you would want to provide. They only need about 1,700 head of cattle. So I don't understand how it is that local production can't meet your procurement needs for grass-fed, healthy cattle in the Northern California region. Not that I'm challenging you, I'm just asking the question. Maybe there's a solution. The other thing that bothers me, I guess, is that, let's just again pick on Kaiser, forgive me for picking on Kaiser, but you said 6,000 meals a day in your hospitals. Well, there's about conservatively estimated 350,000 poor people living in the flatlands of the East Bay. If those people each ate 3 meals a day, that's over 1 million meals a day. Healthy meals that people don't have access to right now. We want to look at upstream solutions. Where do we begin to develop production capacity? How do we begin to build a production, distribution, aggregation, and retail capacity so that everybody has access to healthy food within walking distance of their homes? Since many of these neighborhoods, people don't have cars. It would seem to me that maybe this is impossible, and I think it's related to some of the points you were making. It seems to me that we need at least a two-pronged investment strategy and development strategy that involves finding ways to support the development of a locally owned production and distribution system. We benefited from Silk's worker co-op academy last fall, where, as I said, a worker co-op. There are ways to build worker-owned co-ops for both production and distribution and retail systems. But all of that requires time, human resources, and lots of money. And that's usually for beginning startup enterprises in low-income communities and communities of color, not the place where investment wants to start. And I think we need to figure out how do we flip that set of relationships so that we can begin to find reasonable and satisfying ways to invest and bring investment dollars into these communities, into these neighborhoods, into enterprises like ours, so that we have a leg up. Right now we're investing our own funds and we're making it work. But I think that, I guess my last point, if you'll allow me, it's really important to talk about all these very high-level issues. But I can tell you that this afternoon when I go visit my new 10 lambs, the work that I have to do on my 5 acres, the work that we have to do to plant vegetables, far exceeds what is communicated in conversations like this. And I think we need a realistic appraisal of how much, not only money is involved, but how much time and energy and work, physical labor is involved with making this happen. Thank you.
So I wanted to follow up, that's really good, and the questions that you raised are the answers that we're looking for. And so, can I just ask, who do you sell to? Who do you sell your vegetables and land to? And how big can you grow in the course of the next 2 to 3 years? What would you need to do that?
We farm on 5 acres of land.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We farm on 5 acres of land, so our capacity to grow is maybe to triple or quadruple the number of lambs that we raise every year. They take 5 months to get to market. So the new 10 lambs, maybe we'll have 12 when I get there this afternoon, are going to not be available for sale until the fall. And our vegetables will sell at local farmers markets and restaurants. And we're developing those markets now. Our lambs will also sell to individuals, to butcher shops, and to retail stores that we're hoping to sell to the halal market and to other local communities that event.
So I would just hope that the TDC, Democracy Collaborative, would have a chance to sit down and talk with you and talk about if Kaiser, if UC Berkeley, if these anchor partners actually invested or purchased locally, how would you be able to respond to their demand, and what kind of investments would you need?
And I want to thank Hank, because Hank really pointed me to Hope Collaborative and a lot of the reports that have been done, because he's done so much work locally. So we really depend on everyone here to help inform the Democracy Collaborative what's happening on the ground, because again, this is a year of learning, accessing information so that we pick the right strategies and the phasing of those strategies that's appropriate.
And I'll just say one thing, which I think is important to the equation is, how much what is the price point that would be produced locally compared to what, you know, a commercial producer or, you know, what a Kaiser is paying now. I mean, and it may be appropriate, and Kaiser might even, I don't want to speak for Kaiser, but they might even agree to pay a little bit more, but there's got to be some sense of what that trade-off is. Sure.
I just had one thought, which is that I think about where the wheels fall off the bus. And the wheels fall off the bus now, most of the local food system work, because either you have demand but no suppliers, you have suppliers who don't have capital. So one thought might be thinking about, is there a way to get just very practical around a couple of different markets, and then thinking about a way to bring all three of those folks into the table. And you were mentioning the places where you've had the greatest success, and maybe the CAP person could also talk about this. If it's locally grown produce, bread, and kind of bakery items, and dairy, that might be a great place to say, just looking at anchor institutions, why don't you start in some places where you already have some success? And I don't know what the combined demand might be of people, institutions in the Richmond and West Oakland or Oakland area would be for those three items. But you might say, you know what, we could create I'm just going to pick a number out here, $100 million market. And then if you brought in suppliers, it would be really interesting to say, could you meet that demand today? Yes, no. Could you meet it in 3 years? Yes, no. So we can get a sense of how long it takes to develop the supply chain. And I would bring investors in, because I look at this is a phenomenal opportunity for an investor. Where do you get committed demand? Where do you have local, controllable, scalable supply? And where do you know how much money you're going to make? This is one where you could bring them in and say, maybe there's not an investment opportunity for you today, but there could be one over time if you want to make an equity investment. If you're a foundation and you can make a below market investment, maybe there's a chance for you to step up right now. I mean, it sounds like there's funds that have the flexibility to go across below market. But I just think, why not bring the whole ecosystem together around a very specific couple of markets and say, let's start there and get traction going. Because those are also areas where the local jobs could be not so much in the ag side, which takes a lot of time and energy and effort, but might be more upfront in the processing and distribution and service side, which the barriers to entry for people are a little lower.
I think that's a great idea. In fact, I was thinking, it seems like Kaiser's got the playbook, and can we just get the other acres to plug and play, right? And we've got the priority areas, and so then let's just aggregate this up and then figure out how to get the supply line into that. But I'm very unclear about this commissary thing.
What's a commissary?
Kathleen, do you want to talk? You mean the commissary model under which Kaiser procures food?
Yeah, is that complicated?
So, sorry, I feel like the camera's between us. Yeah, so the commissary model, like I was saying, we source most of our food products for our patient meals regionally because everything is produced in that one South San Francisco commissary. So, for example, if we are getting produce from, say there was produce from Oakland that was going into our patient meals, it would go to South San Francisco. It would be put with all the other produce and other products that are used to make our patient meals, and then it would be sent out to 21 facilities. So it's not one by one. We don't have the kitchen in site where we produce on site at each location. So essentially it's going into a bigger regional food production facility.
Point of entry where everything comes in and really some.
So yeah, everything comes in, it's produced, the food is made from scratch there and then sent out to each location. So that makes it challenging to say, just like I was saying earlier, to get, say, a piece of fruit that was going in Richmond. I mean, unless there was a lot of fruit, to provide enough fruit for those, say, strawberries for 21 facilities, to say this is going to go into the commissary and come back to the Richmond facility, it could go to a different facility. Does that make sense? And then our cafeterias are contracted out. So we have a couple, like Morrison and Fresh and Natural are the two main cafeteria contractors that we work with in our facilities, and they're sourcing from their own, through their own contracts, so their own produce contracts and their own, their other food contracts. So we don't micromanage those contracts, but we do require that they provide, provide healthy food. They provide a certain amount of sustainable food. We don't micromanage it to the degree of which vendor they're going to work with, but there could be potential opportunities there as well.
One follow-up question. Do you require producers or processors ISO 990's certification to say the food's safe?
Yes, they
have
definitely.
HACCP training and all that?
They have to meet certain food safety requirements, definitely, and that is a challenge sometimes with smaller producers or processors. They need to definitely meet those, basic standards for food safety, because we're working with a compromised population.
I just had a quick follow-up question.
Well, I was actually going to invite you to speak. I was wondering if the Democracy Collaborative could tell us about the model of Basil in Cleveland, because I think I want to just reiterate that there's two prongs here. There's actual hospital procurement or university procurement, and there's investment through, say, community benefit dollars. And I don't want us to get hung up on the actual hospital procurement. It's very, very tricky. A lot of work has been done. I would encourage everyone to read CAF's report, Making the Invisible Visible, about all the work that has been done and tried in attempting to bring that local produce into the institutional sector. And so I would just encourage all of us to shake that out a little and know that a lot of learning has already happened about bringing local produce into institutions. But I do think for very specialized crops, and my understanding of this basil.
More than basil, but anyway.
Okay, so maybe you could tell us. I think that the opportunities that might be in some very targeted items if we're talking about procurement.
Okay, so I think what you want us to talk about is Green City Growers, which is in Cleveland, Ohio, and serves the hospital market there, as well as university cafeterias, as well as the local food market. And so that's a employee-owned cooperative that's part of a broader system of cooperatives of startups. And we are looking at startups as a possibility in this work in the Bay Area. There's these 3 employee-owned companies that are all part of this Evergreen Cooperative network. And one of them is a food production greenhouse, and it's a 10-acre site, about 4 acres under glass, actual growing area about 3 1/4 acres. And 4 acres is about the size of 3 football fields, just to give you a sense of scale. And it grows about 3 million heads of lettuce and 200,000 pounds of basil, so that's where you get your basil. But there are multiple crops, and it's meant to, so the climate impact on this, basically 98% of lettuce that's imported, and most of the herbs as well that are imported to Ohio come from, sorry to mention this, California, and are shipped 2,000 miles, and obviously that's not terribly efficient. It also saves, in addition to providing 40 living wage jobs that are also employee-owned, so providing profits for residents in the low-income communities of East Cleveland. It also is saving carbon miles and adding about a week of shelf life because it's not traveling all those miles. So that is a potential instrument that there might be areas where you need scale and you can have sort of a conscious effort to relocalize the supply chain. And there have been studies that have shown it in Cleveland. I'm not going to cite the exact numbers, but there was this report done by Brad Massey from Oberlin and Michael Schumann and other folks called the 25% shift. And you're talking about potential of thousands of jobs. If you just shift 25% of agriculture locally in Northeast Ohio, compared right now, so the other 75% would still be imported. If you did that, you would still create thousands of jobs and generate billions of dollars in economic activities. So there is at least in the long term, a huge potential in this kind of work. And then I did want to ask a question of the Kaiser folks a little bit. I'll put you on the spot a little bit, only in the sense of, so if you think about think of an SFO, for example, in the airports. You know, it used to be that every franchise was just a chain, and then they made an operational decision to favor local producers. So now you get like the, whatever that farmer's market type places in Terminal 2 and some of these other local, you know the stores better than I do, right? Yeah, this is, in terms of concessions, right, they try to give you a San Francisco feel. And I'm wondering, you know, what it would take, you know, not to change the whole commissary system, but let's say you had it so you had so that somebody like in Guerrero could supply the Richmond Hospital. You know, you said 5% of the produce is going to be, a hospital-specific, facility-specific buy or something. You know, and they could actually source, you know, at least on a small scale with some of the existing producers. Is that something that's even within the realm of possibility? What would it take to be able to do some kind of policy change of that kind?
I think at this point, this commissary model has been in place for so long that we don't have the infrastructure in place at our facilities to do the on-site food prep and cooking. So I don't see that happening anytime soon, that we're gonna be purchasing, you know, at each individual facility and producing the food for the patient meals on site. And that is happening with the cafeterias, so maybe there's some potential there. But again, that's Morrison or Fresh Natural, and you know, it would really depend on each location if they were willing to purchase, you know, locally just for that site, or if they're also trying to leverage their volume across not only our sites but others to get, you know, better pricing for their product.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not saying get rid of the commissary system. I'm saying if you could carve out a small percentage and you give like, you know, local flavor, you could feature the local foods, and this would actually potentially be, you know, at least
And we do that, but on a regional scale, because, and part of the food safety, the consistency of, you know, having the same products and meeting the nutritionals across all of the hospitals, and I think that's part of it. That's why it's maybe not so kind of hyper-local as being from that community into that, you know, if that community were able, if, for example, Richmond or producing a product that we could use across all of our facilities, or if it was going into sort of this hub, that sort of distribution hub where a bunch of small producers were providing it, and then we could use that across all our facilities. That might be another way to get the product.
So I had a quick question in terms of, obviously for small producers, issues like food liability insurance and other types of requirements that they need to have can be prohibitive. Are there intermediaries in the Bay Area that are willing to carry that insurance for small producers? There's some models like that in other areas, and I was curious if, I don't know if CAF plays that role at all for any people who are members, or if there are other intermediary or food hub type organizations that could carry the insurance for smaller farmers.
CAF is a nonprofit, so we don't, we used to when we did operate an aggregation hub. But there are other organizations, other farm groups, for example. Kendra mentioned Coke Farms aggregates from 40 other smaller farmers that are really small farmers. And they carry the liability insurance. They make sure that their growers are also food safety certified. So that's just one example of how these things are already happening. And you know, we also work with other distributors like Basin Produce, that do carry that insurance and ask their growers to also be food safety certified. So they do exist, and I think there is a certain amount of leveraging those existing pieces of infrastructure.
One other question, just for CAF, I guess, because you had this you've had this food hub aggregator that didn't work, and I don't need the entire story, but what would you say were sort of the key what were the key challenges that you know, made it not work, what would you, if you were redoing it now, are there certain things you would do differently? I think that might be helpful in thinking through how to approach the situation now.
Yeah, so, I mean, basically our food hub, the Growers Collaborative, was creating another step in the supply chain. We were trying to go around the existing system and create our own alternative to the existing global food system. So trying to drive around to lots of different small farmers, pick up small amounts, and cover all those costs, and make it affordable we were sourcing primarily to institutions. It just wasn't penciling out. That's on top of being a nonprofit, trying to operate this business as an LLC. These are all actually documented in that report that Kendra referenced, making the invisible visible. We were also operating old trucks, didn't have, we're trying to retrofit facilities that weren't really up to code. So there's a lot that could go on and on. It's kind of a sad story and painful to recount.
Well, are there positive lessons, like if you want to do a food hub now, do these 5 things, or?
Yeah, so that is also in there. Things that have been mentioned here, using existing infrastructure, working with those aggregators that are particularly farmer-led, and that when the farmers are taking on that investment and potentially getting some of these loans, to take on some of that work themselves, rather than outsourcing it to a third-party operator to carry that additional costs and then pass that on to the buyers. I mean, those are some of the main things that we found. We're not saying that aggregation hubs totally don't work. I think it's just the third-party operators, standalone, new facilities, those things, we've already seen many across the nation start and fail.
I have a question for Tina, and this sort of also might reference, I know Alex Gomez has started an industrial kitchen here in Panola restaurant. So that example of in LA where you've actually supported small restaurants be able to increase their capacity, how successful was it for them to get larger contracts? Were they able to you go beyond just catering? Were they actually able to target larger, or is that part of the goal? And is there a strategy around that?
So the hope is that they will be, but it is very early days for that project. It's still under construction. So there's no way to tell, but it's not so much for restaurants, but it's more like, think about the small batch processor working in their kitchen at home who just kind of reaches maximum capacity, and now if they want to grow, it needs to do something kind of off market, like use a restaurant's kitchen in off hours in the middle of the night, but you've got to lug all your stuff into the kitchen and you've got to take it home with you. You don't have space in that kitchen. You can't really grow a business that way. And so the idea behind these commercial kitchenettes is to give folks kind of a stepping stone that's in between your home kitchen and having to have your own sort of commercial kitchen facility where you incur all those costs all on your own. It's almost like it's like condominium kitchens, right? So you can share certain facilities like refrigerations and ovens and that sort of thing, but still have your own kind of personal space.
And I just bring that up because the catering strategy was a big one, but I imagine in the hospitals it's not small. It's big numbers, big units. Yeah.
And does the catering not operate under the same commissary? I mean, you don't have that issue of the commissary, so.
No, we don't have that, yeah.
So that is one of those ways that might potentially get rid of that.
The catering is handled at each facility, and it's done differently at different facilities. Sometimes there's one person who centrally manages it, and other times it's somewhat dispersed among, say, the admin staff, and we're still trying to figure out how to best implement this policy, so it's in process, so it seems like it's a potential opportunity. I'm really trying to identify healthy food vendors, in the various communities where we operate, but also where there aren't vendors who meet our needs. It would be an opportunity for somebody to come forward and say, I really want to be able to meet these needs, or I can provide healthy food that meets your standards. So that's, I think, a really good potential opportunity. I think it's fairly well developed in Oakland already, but not, I don't know that the Richmond facility, I'm not sure how many options there are for healthy catering here, how well it's being implemented yet, so there's potential there. One other thing I wanted to mention about the meat, we have been working, and poultry, we've been working with the Physicians for Social Responsibility in the Bay Area and this hospital leadership team to try to leverage all of our volume and look at, larger scale vendors. I know you mentioned, the farm in your area, but we've been looking, I think we, like everyone else who's purchasing sustainable meat on a personal level in a restaurant, wherever, the cost is a huge factor for us. I think in providing hospitals as we weigh, how much can we spend on the food versus other things. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to leverage our volume with other hospitals and look for, vendors that we can work with, to share specifications and get similar products, so it's even larger than just our own hospitals. So, or our other regions plus those other hospitals. So.
I just wanted to add on a nanoscale. The intention of New Hope Farms, plural, is to partner with other small farms locally, like Urban Tilth and potentially Pie Ranch and Pescadero and other farms to bring product together to sell in communities that lack access to fresh, healthy food. And it has we recognize that we're not going to sell everything, and what we intend to do is to identify a small commercial kitchen, like Kitchen at 812, which just happens to be 2 blocks from where I live and within 5 miles of our farm, so that we can do value-added products for sale in our either our own markets or other facilities.
Hi there. So one of the, I think, challenges that we face at the San Francisco Foundation is we support actually a good number of these nonprofit food producers who are located in low-income communities of color, and the reason why we support them is because they have those relationships with the communities to be able to work with those residents who don't have access to, or to increase employment opportunities. And one of the challenges that I think we're seeing with some of these nonprofit food producers is being able to really grow and scale their kind of for-profit arm or the kind of revenue generating side of their work, and there's kind of good reason for those challenges they face because I guess for a lack of a better word, they have a large overhead in being able to work with communities that do face many challenges. So in addition to growing the food, they're working with
we are in partnership with the County Board of Supervisors to develop and design a 3-acre farm in North Richmond. North Richmond is a traditionally low-income, food-dense area without a lot of availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's an endeavor that we're taking on. And I think one of the biggest structures is really getting those below-market investments versus investors wanting to see what we produce. And looking more at the opportunity and potential for larger procurement, especially with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs coming in, well, not so much with Kaiser on the procurement commissary level, but maybe even in the catering level as well. How do we get these organizations or organizations adequately funded to provide infrastructure, whether it's cold food storage and production, or even money to begin to do training programs to help the community residents become these producers of the food that we're looking to supply to larger institutions?
Again, sorry, Ricardo from the Sustainable Economies Law Center. I think part of our work is supporting these smaller farms and organizations that are trying to build in the local food system. But another part of the work that we do is looking at this massive transfer of wealth and land that's going to be happening over the next 10 to 15 years when the baby boomers are retiring. And so I think another thing that we should be looking at, and that what we're looking at, is how do we during that transition, how do we not allow all those companies to leave and all those jobs to leave our communities? And so when we're looking at the producers, maybe part of it is looking at the producers who are already in the supply chain and seeing which ones are right for us. What we're looking at is cooperative conversion. How do we get these employers to sell to their employees, which will increase the social impact, which will divvy out the profits more equitably to community members, which is multiplying the impact of what we're trying to do, I think. So that's another strategy that I think we need to keep in our tool belt, is looking at this exit of ownership. I think studies have been done where only somewhere between 12 and 15% of owners actually pass on their business within their family or their community, and the rest of them get sold off to somebody else. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how can we get in the door, our foot in the door, and figure out where are those levers that we need to pull to get into the supply chain and say, you're going to be exiting, you're going to be selling your company, don't sell it to some outside entity that's outside of this community, that's even further outside of this community. How do we sell it to the employees and do that transition? And that transition is going to cost money. It's going to need investments, because people are going to be needing to come in to do the education with those workers, to get them to think of themselves as part owners. You're going to need need to rethink, how do you manage the democratic enterprise? It's not going to be command and control anymore. These things are going to take time and money, and part of the work that we're doing is trying to set up and find the best practices. And I think a lot of what the Democracy Collaborative is doing is also providing those best practices for us to look to. So just as we're moving forward and thinking about the different strategies, I think that's just something that we're excited about in this opportunity of this ownership transition in our country over the next 10 to 15 years. So looking at the food systems within 250 miles from here, who are those farmers that are going to be leaving? That they don't have anybody to sell their farm to. They're going to sell to the highest bidder. You know, and a lot of those farms, what we need to do is convince them to sell to their employees, or to find local community members who are willing to come in and take ownership of it. So that's, yeah. And I apologize, we have to leave. We're providing free legal advice 3 times a month at our Brazilian Communities Legal Cafe.
Where's that located?
I know that Tina has to leave shortly too, so I want to ask her a question before she dashes off. Money keeps coming up, and support for infrastructure investment. What kind of money, I mean, besides, I guess the real question is, are there investors that's looking specifically at the food sector? And how hard is it to get that kind of money? What kind of credit or other qualifications will community groups need to access below market financing or impact investing? You know, what are some of the goals, and how big is the opportunity?
So it's a great question, and like anything, it kind of depends. But I think in California, what is very unique is that there is a financing product that's been put together specifically to address food financing, and that's the Freshworks Fund, which aggregated $272 million of capital from a variety of investors, from major banks, insurance companies, to foundations, health systems, trade associations. There are a variety of actors, and that money was all aggregated and also incorporated and looped in public subsidies, because it takes a broad spectrum of capital to make this work. It's not just like a traditional, I forget who it was that said it, but it's not just a traditional business model where you set it up, it starts running, you become revenue positive, and it's financeable. There's a lot of layers and a lot of nuance to it, and all those different layers and nuance require different types of capital to make it work, and it's complicated. But I think what's important here, and what the potential here is, in order to access financing, the bottom line is that you have to be able to show an investor or a fund or whoever the provider of capital is that you are going to be able to repay that capital, right? And how do you do that? What's the best way you can do that? Having a contract from a major institutional buyer that shows that you've got, you know, a secure distribution channel for whatever it is that you're supplying. On the other hand, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. On the other hand, the institution is looking at the company, whatever it might be, and saying, well, great, we want to be able to source from you, but you're not at a scale or a level of standardization that kind of meets our needs. And so there's a timing issue, right? And there's a role I think that institutions can play, and maybe, I don't want to say guaranteeing, you rarely want to use the term guarantee when it comes to investing, but maybe an opportunity for somehow institutions to provide future guarantees of contracts once a supplier can grow to a certain point, and a supplier can use that future guarantee to access financing to grow to that scale over time. But there is this sort of timing element and this chicken and egg problem to the supply and demand challenge that we've been talking about. But the capital is there, and particularly here in California. The capital is there and interested in moving into the space. It's just solving that sort of, I don't know, that last connection, that timing issue.
I'll follow up on this because I think some of our work tries to do this at least, and I wouldn't say we quote unquote solve the problem. That would be exaggerating beyond belief. But what we've done, with, for example, with the Green City Growers, is there were letters of intent, which is far short of a contract. And what that's allowed for, though, is for obtaining financing. So the elements have been to have the letters of intent, which says, if it's of X, Y, Z, that quality, and there's plenty of outs. And that means you need a couple other things: working capital, because it will take time to actually build up that book of contracts, and some kind of foundation support or philanthropic support to stand up the business. Those have been the elements, if you will, of the work in Cleveland, and what's starting to happen now with a stormwater co-op that's being, or an employee-owned company anyway, that's being set up in the DC area as well. So, so that's, you're trying to, so the foundation assets plays that third-party role. So there's the anchors agree that they'll at least talk to the business and work with the business and maybe have a member on the board and so forth. The foundation provides some working capital and investment capital that's then leveraged with public and other funding, and then the business still has to perform.
If I could just add on to that. So this notion also that the foundation is going to provide capital deal by deal, transaction by transaction. Foundations are not financing institutions by nature. That's not their day job, right? That's not what they do. So I think you also have to think about how do you aggregate capital in a form that's efficient for the foundations and for the investors in sort of institutional quality product that they're comfortable investing in, that doesn't necessitate them investing in one small project in Richmond, another small project in Oakland, another one you can go ad infinitum across communities in need across the state of California. It's very inefficient. It's not the way that they operate, and I think that presents a challenge in getting to scale, which is, I think, part of what is interesting about the Freshworks Fund, is that it did aggregate all these sources of capital and gave the responsibility for the deployment of that capital over to folks who are financiers who do this. That is their day job, is to finance food retail and food distribution businesses and organizations.
I'll say a couple more things. It was about $8 million aggregated in the fund, and about $40 million leveraged. So these were tiny.
So at a fund level, not transaction by transaction.
Yeah, it wasn't transaction by transaction. Just to be clear on that. But obviously, what you would want over time is what you're talking about in terms of a more institutionalized. But we're still, at least in this work, as far as I know, for startups of that kind, maybe with the Freshworks Fund we have an edge, but I think we're still at that developmental stage. Seems like a big edge.
That's a big edge.
Yeah.
And I would just think about, I think go where you have traction. So if you've got 3 areas that generally institutional buyers can source from locally, again, I think about the bread, the local produce, and the dairy. Maybe then looking at who are the producers in those chains now that are local, again, with that big definition of within, 50 miles and then within 250 miles. But you could start and say how many farms like New Hope are there out there that we want to support. By doing these letters of intent, I helped build a now $8 billion market for organic cotton products. And one of the ways that we did that was we actually had big buyers break down their demand into really small chunks. And they said, you know, organic cotton's really expensive, it's hard to get, we don't know, we're a local company, blah, blah, blah. But we can guarantee that we'll buy this little teeny tiny amount, 100% this year. And so I would think about saying, okay, if the hospitals and schools here know that they are gonna, you know, do their best effort to buy 10% of their stuff from local businesses within 50 miles, as a banker, I would look at somebody who's already in business and say, you know, I might think about it. And then I'm gonna put my arms around the community benefit fund. If the community benefit fund would come up and say, I'll do a loan guarantee for the last 10% of the loan, you know, take away the risk from me as a banker, I might all of a sudden start to go, oh, your 10 goats could really be 50 goats for you guys to eat in your catering business. I don't know, you know, I'm making this up, but if we could start small, looking at how do we grow our existing producers with business. The other thing is, over the next 3 years, you're gonna need infrastructure, right? There needs to be a food hub to aggregate produce, there needs to be a processing hub to aggregate and process flour and grains and other things. And there needs to be, I think about it as a zip car for transportation. You know, if we want local delivery businesses, they need to be able to have a place where they can get a truck and insurance and go and deliver. You know, and like I think about those and I'm wondering who the local entrepreneurs are who might be interested in maybe a co-op model for those core infrastructure businesses. But you're gonna need them here. Every community needs them. So maybe there's a two-pronged track where you're building your local businesses with local demand, and you're also building the infrastructure that's going to grow a lot more businesses. And that's where foundations and, again, community benefit and local banks who have an interest in local economic development could come in.
So I have a two-hander, and that is I like the way you think about, let's figure out where we start where you've got a foundation and grow it. But if we were to make some strategic investments, where is it best in terms of the quantity and quality of jobs, or the health, the greatest health impact? How do we measure success? So should we be investing in the production, the processing, the distribution, the retail? I mean, is there a place where you get the greatest bang for your buck, both on health and wealth creation? And maybe the entry points are not as high in terms of the capital needs or the skill needs or things of that nature. Anybody know?
Just over one though, Richmond, which used to be the greenhouse capital of this area, greenhouse farming offers a chance to grow high-value crops and also gives jobs that are relatively higher. It's not as many as you would have on a farm because it's a more controlled environment, but it's a great place. And there's technology investments that you could potentially co-invest in and co-own by the community or by the local co-op.
I would just mention too that there's recently been a study done with institutional food procurement in Vermont, looking at hospital food procurement and its impact on the local economy, purchasing locally. And I think, I don't have exact numbers, but it was like 1.5 million in sustainable local purchasing, represented between 3 and 4 million economic impact in the community. And they identified two categories within the food system where it had the most impact, and that was in production and in processing. So just an example that's come out pretty recently.
For the urban tilts and the nonprofits of the Bay Area that are ready for program-related investments, the foundation does program-related investments, and like Tina said, it's not efficient, or it's a slow. It's been a slow process for us, so we haven't been getting out as much money as we wanted to because going project by project is like going to a bank processing, or less efficient than going to a bank in processing with us. But we do that, so definitely encourage people to direct nonprofits towards the foundation, or maybe even I can connect to the right person for program-related investments. And as Francesca had mentioned earlier, Greenbelt Alliance is looking into pulling together various sources of funds to create sort of like a regional food fund. And so I definitely encourage you to be in touch with Greenbelt Alliance because they've had a lot of success. We're doing this for affordable housing they created the Transit-Oriented Affordable Housing Fund, in which they got a number of foundations to commit to committing capital, and they leveraged that into private capital, and it's a pretty sizable fund now the public sector did put in the first amount of funds, MTC put in the funds, then philanthropy, then private capital. So I think that was a really good model of how to get investment from various sectors, but having kind of the first risk takers being the public sector and the philanthropic sector.
I wanted to offer up another solution, and Satma can speak more about antibiotic-free chicken procurement and how that's been a success story. CAP worked with School Food Focus to do a lot of assessment on the chicken supply chain and really focusing on one product and looking at who are the current suppliers in California, and found that there were a lot of small-scale suppliers, and then there's Foster Farms, but then there were only a couple of mid-scale producers that we could really support in trying to scale up, and that they held the values that the institutions were looking to purchase from. So Mary's Chicken is a mid-scale chicken producer based in Fresno County area, and they have just been a really great success story in terms of getting institutional support and meeting institutional demand, and really being able to create jobs. They said that when they first opened up their warehouse, there were 1,000 people lining up outside waiting for jobs. And they're now opening a second warehouse due to all the demand that Focus has helped to organize, and trying to get more institutions across California purchasing antibiotic-free meat, and then that's getting antibiotics out of the supply chain. It's also creating kind of pressure on some of the large-scale producers, Tyson and Foster Farms, to look at their practices and see how they can change their practices to meet this growing demand that they're seeing from school districts around the nation.
So one comment first before talking about antibiotics in poultry. The first is there was a question about if one were to make strategic investments, where is the greatest impact in terms of health and wealth creation? I think that's an excellent question. There was a part of me that was wondering who exactly are we hoping to benefit, because I think about the schools that School Food Focus represents, and many of the school districts have around $1.20 to $1.40 to spend on food. That's after labor costs. And they have minimal budgets, and they're stretched thin for time and resources, don't necessarily have the kitchen infrastructure to create meals. So are we going to focus our investment on feeding kids, or are we going to focus our investment on giving workers a living wage? I think we need to do both, but I think there are going to be different interventions needed along the supply chain. So I just wanted to put that out there. With regards to antibiotics, School Food Focus worked with the USDA and the Pew Charitable Trust to develop a standard, a third-party certification around the medical use of antibiotics in poultry production. And we had an announcement about 2 weeks ago about this, and now Tyson and a few other producers are stepping up to verify their production around the responsible use of antibiotics. So now, Tyson is actually one of the biggest suppliers of poultry to schools. So much of the poultry coming to schools now, schools will now have the chance, the opportunity to purchase meat that has been produced more responsibly. I think one of the takeaways there is success with also working with the regulatory environment. And I know that this is a discussion of investments and working with investors, but that is just another thing, something else, an issue that also structures food production and food safety, which has come up many times. How much schools can actually purchase locally. It is legally very tricky to write into contracts that schools, if a school wants to purchase local food due to years of regulations, etc. So I just wanted to add, and just put that into the mix. Not to be a naysayer or anything, but it's just very complicated. Hopefully that expands on what you're saying.
Well, let me give a couple of best practices. I was going to say something else, but let me respond directly to you first. I mean, City of New Orleans School District actually has in their contract a 5% local purchasing requirement, and they were able to put that in. In Washington, D.C., there's something called the D.C. Healthy Schools Food Act, which increases the budget for schools by 5 cents a student if they use local food. So there are policy solutions as well as contractual ways of at least, I won't say solving that problem, that's too strong of a word, but helping towards a solution. So my question though was actually number 2 on this list. So I was actually interested in strategies for so this is supposed to be a learning community in part among the anchors, and how can there, are there spaces for cross-anchor sectoral collaboration? Is there ways that MLC Collaborative, Healthcare Without Harm, Democracy Collaborative can assist with that?
Yeah, there's already existing.
Well, the question is about cross-sectoral collaboration. So, maybe are there ways that we can facilitate conversations that would be helpful between Kaiser and Sutter, for example, or how do you want to think about that?
Well, I can speak a little bit to that about, Kendra mentioned briefly about the hospital leadership team in the Bay Area. And one of the ways that the hospitals have organized themselves here in California is through the development of these leadership teams. So in answer to your question, those hospitals are communicating regularly with one another. The food service directors are in touch with one another. I mean, I think over the past 5 years, there's been a really good, and Kathleen has been a member of the Bay Area leadership team for years. I mean, there's a very good communication among the hospitals within the Bay Area, for example, about procurement and sourcing and local sourcing and aggregated volume strategy, which Kathleen was mentioning. And more recently, we've begun to develop what we're calling the Ed-Med collaboration. And there's a lot of momentum, as I said earlier, about working with School Food Focus, the K through 12. The University of California is at the table talking about sustainable meat procurement. So among those 3 sectors anyway, there's a lot of really good conversation that's already begun.
Just to build on what Lucia was saying, I think in addition to the hospital leadership team, the Ed-Med collaborative she's mentioning, which is kind of just starting up, and we have been actually communicating with, Kaiser, with School Food Focus, and kind of looking at how we each procure. I mean, the focus has been primarily on antibiotic-free poultry, but we've been looking at how can we leverage that volume, how can we work cross-sectorally to get healthier food into both of our institutions, to healthcare institutions and into schools. And one of the things we've learned is just the challenges around how our contracting works, how we purchase food differently, the different regulations and constraints in each of our situations. Like, we have longer term contracts, like 5 years more, and like the schools have short, I think they have to bid on products sometimes every year. I mean, it's a very different way of purchasing. So I think some of what we're learning can maybe benefit in looking at how sectors within each of these communities work together.
So just as a time checker, I wanted to put up 2 more comments and then we'll wrap up, because I know this has been a very deep and fulfilling conversation. It's a lot to follow, so we want to get you home to start your rest of your week. Would you have
Yes. Well, I just think, again, we want to kind of find places where the sizes and the needs fit. So in some ways, it's great if schools are on a 1-year cycle and you're on a 5-year cycle, fabulous. So maybe there's ways to get your local suppliers up and going, in those 1-year contracts. And the key thing, I keep thinking, where is the, in the federal government, there's a thing called GSA Advantage, and it's where all the government agencies go, I want to buy 457 million trucks, and I want to buy 847 cleaning supplies. There's something about, I'd love to see a Ed-Med, et cetera, anchor community articulation of demand and sort of really specific things that are happening, like this year we are going to have a contract on this. We're going to have a contract for 5 years, but in 5 years, keep your eye over here, so that the businesses can plan for that. The other thing is, I think it's actually really beautiful that you have a diversity of small farmers from 5 to about 100 acres. Like I look at farmers in that scale, and I don't know what the animal size is, but that gives you a lot of ability then to pair people potentially, so that you can get enough if you need it, or you can have just small enough if you need just small. You know, and so I don't know, there's a part of me that wants to figure out how do you get a diverse enough group of all three, the buyers, the investors, and the farmers. One group I want to make people aware of is Slow Money, Northern California. Slow Money is a group of mostly individual investors who are investing in very small food and farm enterprises, like $5,000, $25,000. They're not multi-million-dollar deals. And they're people who are from local communities. And there's already been about $20 million invested in Bay Area companies. RSF Social Finance also has a farm hub, food hub, infrastructure financing, and they finance smaller projects like $500,000 to $5 million with both debt and equity, and they can actually do PRIs or grants.
Who's this?
RSF Social Finance?
They're actually, we've invited them, so they're aware.
And the Whole Foods Producer Fund, I'm sorry, I'm looking at this room and I'm going like, where are they here? Because A, they should be providing food and bringing food, affordable food, like they're doing in Detroit. But also they have a small producer development fund. Whole Foods, they have a producer development fund. Like, get their dollars in here too. I mean,
Yeah, we have a distribution center here. And they actually fed us.
okay. So they should be here too.
Do we have time, Tara, for one more?
Yeah, one more, and
Okay.
then,
Oh, there we go. No, here we go.
I just have a question, and seeing if maybe this is possible to bring this sector that's usually excluded from every conversation, that's dealing with prisons and the food that they procure, and how we can work on that too, and bring them to the table here, because I think it's also important that we're looking at that population that is completely neglected, and it keeps growing and growing, especially in California, so it's just something I wanted to raise.
all right, so Gary's gonna, thank you.
Yeah, so anyway, we're going to need to close this out, but we wanted to really thank everybody for coming forward with some of your ideas and some of your suggestions and some of your critiques, because it's all about grist and mill and helping us develop this project further. And we'll be continuing to work on this over the next bunch of months, and when we come out with a report about what we've learned and what we've shared, we're happy to share it with everybody and tell you where we'll go with it, and have you again respond to our strategy going forward. So I would say it would be there's two local people who are really important point people on this project. One is Lucia, Kendra on the food part, but Tara is also playing a really fundamental role, and these smart guys over here are doing a lot of the research to come up with a brilliant strategy. So these are your point people in terms of feedback, additional ideas and suggestions you may have. And thanks so much for joining us today.